To understand our times, we must first understand theirs. So begins a new book covering a tumultuous and transformative age in Canadian politics when a rivalry between two men defined an era and set the stage for the country as we know it today. Here to talk about the duel, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the making of modern Canada is author John Ibbitson. Welcome, John.
Hello.
Congratulations, first of all, on the duel. I think it joins other books like Renegade in Power and Rogue Tory in this sort of a pantheon of political writing. And these are two of the books you cite in your research. What inspired you to tell this particular story?
Well, there are a couple of things. First of all, those two books that you talked about are very fine books, but they paint a certain picture of John Diefenbaker as an erratic, temperamental, unpredictable, in some ways incompetent prime minister who took the largest majority government in Canadian history up until that time and sort of threw it away because he couldn't clearly state a purpose and a reason for governing. And over the course of the years as a journalist, I kept coming across innovations, changes, reforms that happened on Diefenbaker's watch. And it occurred to me that maybe we needed a rethink. Maybe we needed to take a second look at the Diefenbaker years. And if we did take that look, we might find something quite different in terms of the accomplishments of him as prime minister and of his government. So that was the first part. The second part, though, was just to tell a good story. This was the biggest political rivalry in the history of the country. Two leaders over four elections, 10 years, fighting it out for power, for control, and coming to despise each other in the process until the country itself became rather sick of it. And we had Centennial and the arrival of Pierre Trudeau and the end of that great duel. But it wasn't just a political fight. Despite the storms and the tempests, Diefenbaker and Pearson together forged the collective welfare state that we enjoy today. They gave birth to the modern camera. They gave birth to the modern Canada. And it was those reforms taking place in the midst of that great political drama that I wanted to explore.
Now, one of the goals of the book seems to be, as you just stated there, to correct the historical record, a lot of it based on the reporting of the time. As you put it, most political journalists wanted to see the Liberals in power, Lester B. Pearson as prime minister, and considered it their mission to help bring about that happy state of affairs. Are we still guilty of that a little bit today?
Well, much less so than then. The press gallery in the 1950s was quite explicitly large L liberal. And not surprising, the Liberals had been in power pretty much since the end of the First World War, with the exception of R.B. Bennett, and one term only for him. So there was a really tight bond between most of the gallery, not all of it, but most of it, and the Liberal Party. Is the gallery today liberal? I use the word Laurentian. It is part of what I call the Laurentian elite, a group of political and journalistic and academic and cultural figures in central Canada who tend to run the show. That's still the case now, but you can be a Laurentian and a conservative too. There's no problem with that.
Now, you managed to find a way to show that these two men had some things in common in a way that at first flush they couldn't seem more different. For instance, Diefenbaker was 8 or 9 when he declared, "I'm going to be prime minister someday," while Pearson, as he so often did, sort of fell into the position. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, Pearson loved to say that he kind of fell into the position, but he had a pretty good way of maneuvering himself to get ready for that fall. But yes, they were very similar growing up, though. And indeed, the third purpose of the book, as well as sort of revisiting the prime ministerships and telling the drama of that great fight, is to show how their story is, in fact, in many ways, the story of the country and its development. They were born, both of them, in small town Ontario. One was a preacher's son, one was a teacher's son, in a Canada that was by no means sovereign, barely more than a colony, a barely self-governing dominion. At 8, Diefenbaker moved out west, and Pearson's family stayed in Ontario. But as their careers progressed through the First World War, through the Depression, through the Second World War, through the post-war years, the country progressed as well. And their story is the story of Canada moving from a Victorian practically colonial existence when they were born, to the great fight over the positioning of nuclear weapons on Canadian soil, which was one of the great contests of the Diefenbaker and Pearson years.
It's hard to believe now, given what we've been saying about the feud between these two, but at one point they actually got along when Pearson was an external affairs minister and Diefenbaker the critic. As you put it, their relationship had been respectful, even cordial. A decade and a half later, it had become utterly toxic. Pearson detested Diefenbaker. How did this come to pass?
Well, part of it was inevitable. If you had a leader of the Conservative Party and the leader of the Liberal Party both in that position for a decade through 4 elections, they're not going to be the best of friends at the end of it. But it's also true that Diefenbaker loved the thrill of politics. He loved being on the floor of the House of Commons. He was a great orator. He had a great popular appeal among the so-called little people, as some people like to call them. Pearson had spent his career largely in the halls of power as a diplomat, as a minister of external affairs. He spoke with a slight lisp. He wasn't a natural orator. And so, especially when Pearson became prime minister in 63 and in the years after, Diefenbaker flayed him on the floor of the House of Commons. Now, there was a lot to flay. The Pearson government had many accomplishments, but it was also marked by one scandal after another after another. Diefenbaker loved those scandals and loved tormenting the Liberal front bench with them. And Pearson had to put up with it. So, not surprisingly, he came to really despise Diefenbaker.
Now, when we look at the duel in purely electoral terms, the first time these two face off is in the 1958 election. And one of my favorite lines in the book is one you borrowed from John Duffy. Running Lester Pearson against John Diefenbaker in 1958 was like booking Pat Boone versus Elvis, a dull crooner opposite a rock star. But you also argue the 58 election also changed the country forever. How so?
Prior to the 58 election, and there were signs of it happening in the 57 election as well. Prior to that, the West had been largely Liberal territory. John Diefenbaker used to joke that the only thing protecting conservatives in Saskatchewan were the game laws. But there was an increasing disaffection among Western farmers and among Westerners in general towards the Liberals, who they thought were taking the West for granted. John Diefenbaker came out of the West, came as a populist, as a already famous crusading defense attorney before he entered the House. And he embodied that sense of this is our time, this is our place, and now we are going to speak with our own voice. And that led to a crushing defeat among Liberals in Western Canada. And with rare exceptions, that defeat was permanent. The West was and is, to a large degree, outside of the Lower Mainland, permanently estranged from the party.
Now, Diefenbaker and Pearson would face off 2 more times until Pearson became the prime minister in 1963. When we talk about the legacy of those 3 Diefenbaker governments, you once again go against the accepted narrative, and you call out Peter C. Newman, the late great now Peter C. Newman, whose narrative you say was flawed, inaccurate, and the product of the author's own insecurities. What would you say then are the principal achievements of the Diefenbaker years?
They were many, but let's just take a couple. We talk about Lester Pearson as the father of Medicare, and in many ways he was. This book doesn't in no way seeks to diminish Pearson or his accomplishments, but the Diefenbaker government launched universal public hospital care. So under Diefenbaker, you could go to an emergency ward, or you could be scheduled for surgery and not have to worry about how much it would cost, whether you could afford it. Tommy Douglas, the Premier of Saskatchewan, took that money and expanded it to create Medicare. Diefenbaker didn't think he had a mandate to create Medicare. He hadn't campaigned on it. So he created a Royal Commission chaired by his good friend, Emmett Hall. Hall was a Saskatchewan boy. They'd been in law school together. Diefenbaker had elevated him to the Supreme Court. They were good friends. Diefenbaker well knew what Hall would recommend. Diefenbaker and Tommy Douglas and Emmett Hall all came out of the same Prairie Saskatchewan culture. But Diefenbaker was defeated, and so the Hall Commission reported to Lester Pearson, and Lester Pearson implemented Medicare. But there was that kind of seamless progression from the Diefenbaker to Pearson via Hall in healthcare. One more that I would mention is immigration. Until the 1950s, 1958, the most racist place in Canada was the Immigration Department. Its job was to keep Canada white, to keep Europeans and only Europeans and Americans coming into Canada. Diefenbaker appointed Ellen Fairclough, the first woman cabinet minister, by the way, to immigration with a mandate to clean it up. It took her years to do it, but in January of 1962, she stood in the House of Commons and announced a new order in council, which said that your race, your color, your religion, the color of your skin, the origin, the country that you're coming from, shall have no bearing on whether you are fit to enter Canada as an immigrant. Only your skills, your ability to contribute to the country will matter. That was the beginning of multiculturalism in this country. Pearson then took that order in council and formalized it in the point system, one of Canada's greatest inventions, if you ask me, and created a truly race-blind system for adjudicating who should and who should not become a permanent resident of this country. So between Diefenbaker clearing out the Immigration Department and Pearson creating the point system, we have the multicultural Canada that we have today. I could name a number of different areas in which similar reforms were launched by Diefenbaker and completed by Pearson. That's what I mean when I say that the two of them, in essence, almost governed together in spite of their tremendous rivalry.
So Diefenbaker's far from the dithering windbag, as you put it, that he's been consigned to in history.
Oh, he could be a dithering windbag too, and he was temperamental and he was indecisive, but he had a very strong cabinet and with strong cabinet ministers, and they produced many reforms. And then there was his own great legacy, the Bill of Rights, his greatest achievement as prime minister. Now, some people will say that, oh, well, never mind, the Supreme Court eventually struck down the Bill of Rights. But as Rosalie Abella, former Justice Rosalie Abella told me, he put the rights agenda on the agenda. Pierre Trudeau was like the Diefenbaker, had him over to lunch. One of the reasons was that they could make fun of Robert Stanfield, the Conservative leader. But the other one was that Trudeau was trying to entrench a rights agenda into the new constitution that he was trying to bring home from Britain. And he recognized that Diefenbaker introduced that debate when he introduced and passed his own Bill of Rights.
Now, probably the best and certainly most famous example of the duel between Pearson and Diefenbaker is the flag debate, and you really show how one of them was forward-looking and the other firmly wedded to the past. And I've been quoting you all interview long, but I can't help myself. The single greatest difference between Lester Bowles Pearson and John George Diefenbaker was their ability to grow. And to me, the flag debate shows that Pearson could and Diefenbaker couldn't. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely fair to say. Diefenbaker, whatever his accomplishments, continued to believe that the British Empire was the greatest civilizing institution on earth, and Canada was a proud member of it. He failed to recognize, or simply could not emotionally accept, I think would be a better way to put it, that the British Empire was over, that the United States was now the preeminent global power. Pearson understood that, recognized it early. In fact, he was American ambassador at one point. And recognized as well that Canada had to develop its own national state, its own self-identity, if it was to carry on in the world. And that meant a flag, and that meant a flag that did not have the Union Jack on it. For Diefenbaker, a flag without the Union Jack was a desecration, and he fought endlessly and relentlessly to prevent the Maple Leaf flag from becoming Canada's flag. He failed, and as I said in the book, he deserved to fail. And it showed how, in the end, Diefenbaker could not look forward to the future. He could only look backward to the past. That is also true of Quebec, but that's a different discussion.
And let's talk legacy and getting back to the reason you wrote the book. As you say, however likable Mike Pearson may have been, and however difficult John Diefenbaker may have been at times, they shared many of the same values, making their governments a continuum of progress toward the Canada we know today. So why then has that perception persisted that one accomplished much while the other accomplished little? Why has that been allowed to persist?
You know, conventional wisdom gets quickly entrenched. And it was certainly quickly entrenched thanks to Peter C. Newman's Renegade in Power, which was in my high school library when I was growing up, that the Diefenbaker government was incompetent, and that's all there is to it. The purpose of this book, well, first of all, the purpose of the book is to tell a really good story. I hope people find it a rollicking tale, because I certainly found it a joy to write in that sense. But also, I hope that we can, without, again, in any way diminishing the achievements of Lester Pearson, recognize that for all of the tempests the Diefenbaker government had major, solid achievements. And some of the things the Pearson government accomplished would not have been accomplished had John Diefenbaker not laid the groundwork.
What do you hope people get out of the book, and are there any lessons to be drawn for our current age, say Trudeau versus Polyev?
I talked in an essay in the Globe and Mail. This isn't in the book, but I think it's implicit in the book that the two prime ministers, Pearson and Diefenbaker, operated from a deep well of consensus. Now, that wasn't just in Canada. Republicans and Democrats in the United States, Labour and Conservatives in Britain, all worked from the assumption that big government had won the war, big government had won the peace by investing in training and education and creating a new middle class and creating the suburban middle class, and that big government should carry on in areas of healthcare, in areas of education, to make the lives of people better. Diefenbaker was the first truly populist prime minister. He truly did come from a working class background, but he, as the son of a teacher who became a prairie farmer, and a bad one, always sought to build up, to make life better for the people that he had grown up among. And that included, by the way, First Nations and Métis people who he grew up among and who he represented as a lawyer. I worry today, many people worry today, the populism is becoming a more polarizing force, a force based more on pure resentment, perhaps a force that seeks to tear down rather than to build up. If Pierre Poilievre does become prime minister, and if he becomes a populist prime minister, my hope is that Mr. Poilievre remembers his predecessor, John Diefenbaker, and remembers that what Diefenbaker always sought was not to destroy, but only to build.
The Duel, Diefenbaker, Pearson, and the Making of Modern Canada is published by Signal Books. A rollicking tale indeed. My thanks to author John Ibbitson.
My pleasure.